Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are opening up a really remarkable set of sources. They demand we fundamentally rethink how we understand memory, time, and, well, the deep, challenging work of trauma processing. We're diving into the unique internal architecture of the mind of an autistic Gestalt language processor, or GLP. And the central idea here is that this structure, it doesn't just look different from typical models, it actively clashes with them.
It's such an urgent piece of work because you can tell the author wasn't just, doing academic research. They were looking for the language to describe their own lived reality, the kind of reality that is so often just completely overlooked or dismissed. They talk about going into the literature and finding something even more damaging than just an absence. They found what they describe as negation, a deep institutional gaslighting, where scholars were, and this is their phrase, speaking confidently against what I know from the inside.
Wow. That immediately sets the stakes for this deep talk, doesn't it? We aren't just looking at, interesting cognitive differences. We're looking at a structure that has often been actively rendered inadmissible by the very fields that are supposed to offer help. So our mission for you, the listener, is to really unpack the specific, elegant mechanics of GLT memory, to understand why returning to the same story isn't just common, but essential for integration, and what happens internally when the past doesn't just recede politely, but, as they say, arrives all at once. Okay, let's get into it. Let's start with the foundational architecture. Because for most of us, time is, well, it's a single unfolding sequential line, right? A, then B, then C. But these sources are so clear that for GLPs, temporality is something else entirely. It's described as being layered, stored, and held in states of readiness. Memory, they argue, it just does not recede politely into the past. It stays very, very present, but in a highly organized, structured way.
Right. And to really understand this, we have to grasp this core concept of what they call preserved nows. This is crucial. It's not just one continuous eternal now. Instead, the system holds many preserved intact moments. Think of them less like beads on a string and more like, distinct coherent files saved on a powerful computer desktop. And each file is whole. It contains the full sensation, the emotional truth, the precise orientation of that moment, and each one is coherent in its own right.
I really like that file analogy. It made sense that under normal conditions, these nows stay differentiated. They stay in their folders, so to speak.
Yeah.
But then you bring stress or trauma into the picture. And here's where it gets really interesting.
It does. The sources detail what happens when that stress or trauma triggers what they call a temporal collapse. The many differentiated nows, they start collapsing together.
Right.
And the effect on the person is not chaos. This is key. It's a profound saturation. Imagine opening every single file on that desktop simultaneously, all of them pressing forward at once. The result is a single, dense present that felt eternal and overwhelming, where multiple moments are all demanding immediacy.
And the natural response to hearing that, for someone who's used to linear time, is to label it dysregulation or a panic attack. But if these sources are right, the internal reality is fundamentally different. But wait, if this is perceived as too much coherence, how does a therapist or even the individual distinguish that from, what we usually call dissociation or a complete psychological break? What's the practical difference in the experience?
That is the critical question. And it's the bridge between the inside experience and the outside labeling. From the outside, yes, it absolutely looks like a severe regulatory issue. But the author stresses that from the inside, this state is actually recognizable, structured, and familiar. Yes. The system isn't breaking down. It's attempting to make sense of incoming data by collapsing relevant patterns. This is autistic temporality under stress, pattern recognition firing across layers of lived experience.
So what's often mislabeled as this dramatic overreaction is revealed instead as the system perceiving too much coherence at once. It's an informational overload because there's no natural temporal buffer to separate those preserved moments.
Exactly.
The entire library is being checked out at the same time.
Exactly. And if we accept that, it radically shifts the entire conversation away from, standard behavioral management. If the system is perceiving too much coherence, the standard therapeutic approach of demanding linear progress or focusing only on emotional regulation without addressing the cognitive structure is, well, it's guaranteed to fail.
Which brings us directly to how integration and healing actually work in this architecture. Because if you hold memory as these whole systems, the traditional demand that trauma must be broken down into neat sequential parts to be filed away just makes no sense.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
At all. And this is why we have the section titled Gestalt Processors, why we return to the same story and why that isn't rumination. We are culturally conditioned to view repetition as a flaw,
Mm-hmm.
as rumination, getting stuck, or, being unable to move on. But the GLP process reframes this recursion not as rumination, but as re-entry.
That is such a powerful reframing.
Hmm.
Re-entry. We are taught that healing means you speak less about the traumatic event, you move toward silence, toward closure. But the sources argue that for this system, healing doesn't come from extraction or some kind of premature closure.
Hmm.
It comes from return.
And they explain why that reentry is productive, which is the really nuanced part. New meaning doesn't emerge because the past is being mindlessly replayed. It emerges because, fundamentally, the self has changed. With each return, you, the person, have shifted. You've gained new life experiences. And that allows a slightly altered orientation to be taken toward the exact same field of overwhelming experience. It's a mechanism for integration, not a sign of being stuck.
I can see how that directly contradicts so many therapeutic models that assume, once you've told the story once, you've processed it.
Right.
It completely flips the script on what progress is supposed to look like.
Precisely. The sources describe this as whole memory processing. Trauma arrives as a totality, a flood of sensation, context, effect, and meaning all pressing forward together. The core difficulty for the GLP, then, isn't necessarily regulation in the traditional sense. It's translation.
Translation.
Yes. How do you take this dense, simultaneous reality and translate it into a sequential, linear language that the world demands to hear?
So when a therapist or a loved one demands that the story be broken into discrete parts, they are asking the mind to perform an act of segmentation that just violates its natural architecture.
Yeah.
It sounds like these analytic models are treating the system's natural density as excess and simultaneity as dysfunction.
Yes.
They're trying to solve a structure problem with a sequence solution.
That's a perfect way to put it. And that persistent attempt to force a round peg into a square hole, well, that leads us directly to the profound stakes that are discussed. When this necessary, structured way of processing is continually invalidated, it results in a specific, deep injury, they term, and it's a chilling term, trauma after gaslighting.
Can we just unpack that for a minute? Trauma after gaslighting.
Yeah.
Because that suggests the structural damage comes not just from the original trauma, but from the sustained disconfirmation of the person's reality.
Exactly. The source suggests that when external systems, academic, therapeutic, social, continually insist that the way you perceive the world is wrong or impossible or implausible, it causes structural damage. The phrase they use is, knowing itself loses ground.
Wow.
If your mind is built to find coherence and simultaneity, and the world insists that only sequential coherence counts, you stop trusting your own internal data.
That's just incredibly isolating. If your internal reality structure is constantly disconfirmed, where do you even stand? This explains why the process of repair has to be so radically different from standard models.
It does. Repair is relational. And in this context, the sources assert that repeated validation is not dependence or insecurity, it is repair. If reality itself has been destabilized, you don't rebuild trust by just being independent immediately. Meaning has to be spoken into a relationship repeatedly, not just once, to reconstruct that foundational security that, yes, your perception can actually survive contact with the outside world.
So validation isn't just some nice-to-have emotional buffer. It's the actual structural cement for rebuilding the self. That's a powerful idea. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sources seem to argue that this systemic dismissal is driven by the fact that the GLP experience threatens existing clinical frameworks.
Absolutely. The traditional literature, it often doesn't just overlook the GLP experience, it actively renders it implausible. Their lived coherence is found inadmissible because it suggests that the linear, analytic frameworks the systems are built on are, well, they're incomplete. The author identifies this as a systemic dismissal of autistic GLPs as epistemic contributors. Their way of knowing is not accepted as valid knowledge.
This gives a completely new context to the ethical claim they make, which is talking as a form of memory integrity. If speech is what you use to translate that simultaneity into sequence, then speech is maintenance for the GLP system. It's keeping that dense memory intact while the system slowly reorganizes itself.
That's exactly right. Think of it like a complex, three-dimensional sculpture you're trying to describe to a two-dimensional world. You have to keep describing it, keep walking around it to maintain its integrity in your own mind. And when external systems, therapeutic or otherwise, discourage that continued narration in the name of efficiency or independence, they are making a critical mistake.
They mistake silence for integration and recreate the conditions of epistemic withdrawal. So silence isn't healing here. Silence is actually confirming to the person that their reality doesn't matter, pushing them further inside themselves. The act of narration isn't indulgence, it's literally survival.
It is, and it creates this massive pressure point for the individual. You're caught between this structural need for continued maintenance and a world demanding you be less verbally efficient, or most cruelly, to just get over it.
That pressure brings us to the ultimate foundational question raised in the sources.
Yeah.
Is this trauma, or is this how my mind works? And I love that the author just refuses the diagnostic fork that forces people to choose one explanation over the other.
They reject the whole dichotomy. The powerful assertion here is cognition precedes trauma. Trauma moves through it. Trauma and Gestalt cognition, they're not competing explanations for a person's experience. And by rejecting that demand for a single origin narrative, the work protects both their inherent coherence and the need for care simultaneously.
Which is so crucial for recovery. Because if you accept that your cognitive structure is just different, that you process in wholes, not segments, you stop fighting yourself. You stop demanding a linearity that just isn't possible. You can move from self-warfare to self-acceptance.
That's the key. So what does recovery actually look like when that temporal collapse has occurred? It is explicitly not a reset. Time does not just snap back into sequence. The process is described as a gradual redifferentiation, where the many preserved nows begin slowly to separate again.
So we're not waiting for a single moment of breakthrough or catharsis. We're looking for subtle, gradual shifts. What does that slow recovery practically feel like for the GLP?
It's a slow, quiet process. The sources describe it as the fatigue just slowly easing, the sharp edges of sensation losing their immediate sharpness. The system's ability to tell which specific moment you are standing in starts to return.
Okay.
It requires permission to be slower, thinner, and maybe less verbally efficient for a while. And the great lesson here is that forcing orientation just risks another collapse. Integration happens through return, not force.
The ultimate arc of this entire reflection, as it's detailed in the sources, it moves toward what they call sovereignty. The ability to document what happens when a Gestalt system is allowed to remain whole enough to make meaning on its own terms. It's a refusal to be fixed to fit existing therapeutic or academic frameworks, because the documentation itself proves the system already works.
And ultimately, the author finds this profound stability in just accepting the cyclical nature of the experience. They know temporal collapse is possible, but that knowledge no longer feels like threat. It feels like information. And that acceptance is the cost and the power of a system that holds meaning whole. It allows for recognition sooner, and it builds this deep internal trust that integration will come, but only through return.
And before we wrap up, we want to end by just reiterating the profound role of you, the listener, in this whole process. The sources are explicit that your attention is not passive when you engage with this kind of work. It does something critical. It provides continuity when time itself becomes unstable. Reading, listening, and returning to this information, these are described not as small solitary acts, but as relational anchors that make this deep personal writing possible in the first place. So we'll leave you with this final provocative thought. What structural truths might we be missing in any field of knowledge, from science to therapy to history, when we rely only on authorized linear mirrors, and how much radical foundational power lies in simply choosing to speak where the map says nothing lives?